Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Readings from Oconomowaukee virtual event series from Books and Company in Oconomowaukee and Boswell in Milwaukee. And to introduce tonight's event, I bring you Lisa from Books and Company.
I'm really excited to welcome Peter Geye to our virtual event. We wish he was in store. It was sad, but we're thrilled to have him here tonight. Peter is the author of Safe from the Sea, The Lighthouse Road, Wintering, and Northernmost. And Northernmost is the latest in the Ide family saga, and this will be the last that's directly dealing with the Ide family, but it is a wonderful way to wrap up this story. When Peter's not writing for himself, he's hanging out with his kids and his family in Minneapolis, and he's teaching at the Loft Literary Center in Minneapolis. So if you go visit Minneapolis, it is an amazing spot to see at the Center of Books. The Center of Books, is that what it is? Minneapolis Center of Books in Minneapolis. So you may not see Peter, but you can go see the building. Peter is going to talk a little bit about Northernmost. Give us a little, if you were a bookseller, Peter, what would you say to the customer blurb? And then we're going to start just having conversation. So welcome, Peter. And finally, it's here.
Yeah, finally is right. And before I say anything about the book, I want to, of course, thank both Daniel and you, Lisa, for what is, I think, even though this isn't the same as usual, you guys have both hosted me for each of my books so far. And I'm so grateful for the friendship and the support over the years. It's truly amazing that you guys have taken this Minneapolis guy under your wings and been so such terrific friends and such terrific advocates for my work. I'm really grateful. And the only thing that bums me out about this is, of course, that I'm not there. I love coming to your stores. They're two of my favorite in the whole world. I guess we can only hope that maybe when the paperback comes out, we'll be walking among each other and we can visit in person then. So thanks a lot for hosting me tonight. And everyone out there in the whatever it is, in the ether, thank you too for coming. I know that this is strange, but I think everyone is getting a little better at it. At least I hope everyone is getting a little better. I feel a little more comfortable doing it after doing a few of these. And so I'll do my best to tell you guys about Northernmost. Like Lisa said, my plan is I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the book, and then I'm going to do a very short reading, but what I'm looking forward to most is having a conversation with the two of you, of course, but also any of you in the audience that have questions, please ask. I say all the time that a writer spends most of their time sitting at their desk alone, and this is our chance to be out in the world, and I really do look forward to your questions. So whether you've read the book or not, it just came out a week ago, so I'm sure that most of you haven't, but I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. So Northernmost, where am I? Oh, there I am. Yep, you can see that. As Lisa mentioned, this is the third book in a family saga that started 8 years ago, I guess, is when The Lighthouse Road came out. Which means I started writing this family saga, including portions of this book, as long as like 10 years ago, maybe even a little bit more than that. And I'll tell you just a little bit about it. So this story sort of bookends the whole family story. And there are 7 generations of family in this story over the course of the last 3 books, which include The Lighthouse Road and Wintering. And this Northernmost deals with 2 of those generations of family. I mean, it sort of hopefully spans the other generations. But in one storyline, there's taking place in the late 1890s in faraway Norway, and in a place called Spitsbergen. There's a man named Oconomowaukee who, for many reasons, has gone off into the Arctic to try and make a living, and ends up in a terrible accident with his hunting partner, who is mauled and killed by a polar bear, and Oconomowaukee is left to survive. He's given up for dead himself. And the book begins with him returning to his own funeral, and his wife, who is, I guess, surprised would be one way of saying it, maybe a little taken aback and maybe even a little bit unhappy that he's there in the flesh and not and that she's not free of him altogether. But his story chronicles his time in the Arctic his rekindling of his romance with his wife, and his great, terrific longing for his daughter, who they sent away to America, to Minnesota, a couple of years earlier. Several years later, more than 100 years later, in fact, his 3 times great-granddaughter, a woman named Greta, who is a Minnesotan, who's married to a Norwegian man herself, living in Minneapolis, and a descendant, of course, of her family on the North Shore and in Norway, is navigating some treacherous terrain of her own, most notably a marriage that she's pretty unhappy in. And she plans to go and confront her husband, who's on business in Norway, and sort of either end their marriage or put her to rights or something, but gets sidetracked instead and ends up in the town of her birth. And her story is one of self-actualization. It's a story that chronicles the devastation of a divorce, but also the excitement and thrill of falling in love again. She navigates her own family life. I like to think that she's a character that if you're not rooting for at the beginning, you might be by the end. And she's really, I don't know, I love Greta. And so I want to read just a short section from her first scene. And all you need to know is that this is taking place in 2017. And she's in Hammerfest, Norway, which is the northernmost town in the world. She might have been watching herself asleep at home, the soft rise and fall of her belly and the arch of her hip under the gray duvet made violet by winter's darkness. But she wasn't watching herself, and she certainly wasn't sleeping. She hadn't slept properly since she couldn't remember when. And so she wasn't dreaming herself into a hummock of snow. She knew the mounds and curves were buried gravestones taking light from the quivering aurora. She followed the light skyward, up above the hillside as it melded into the blues and greens, and then an almost glaring orange, the color of a Lake Superior sunrise. She could as easily have been standing back on the shoreline in Gunflint now, or evening behind her, but in fact she had never been so far from home, and all that stood behind her was the dark church, and beyond that, Sorrow Sound and the islands distant across the water. She resisted an inclination to turn around and stare seaward, moving instead to another grave marker and brushing off the snow. She'd arrived here, in the graveyard, with as little forethought as she'd used in flying north altogether. Upon landing in Hammerfest, she checked into a hotel and tried to sleep and then tried to eat. Failing at the last 2 tasks, she'd put her boots back on and stepped again into the darkness. On the Strandgata, she looked left and right and saw in the latter snowy distance the church steeple. It seemed as fine a destination as any, and 2 blocks later, she crossed into the cemetery with her mind suddenly on her ancestors, who might be buried here. She cleared the first few markers of snow and played her iPhone's flashlight over the ground. She did this half a dozen times and then looked down the line of graves before scanning the graveyard altogether. Hundreds of stones were mounded under the snow. So instead of harvesting ghosts, she bunched her coat collar and gazed upward and studied the sky for what seemed a long time. If she missed Franz or the kids, she didn't feel it. Even as she conjured them sitting around the fire ring outside her father's fish house on a night such as this, the sky over Minnesota lit with its own phosphorescence, she felt only her own heart beating in time with the falling light of the polar sky above. So that introduces you to Greta, who has found herself in this town in Norway where her ancestors are from. And what's about to happen to her is all sorts of things, like I mentioned, not least of which her life is going to change altogether. And I guess with that, I'll just welcome Lisa and Daniel back into the conversation. Thanks again for having me, guys, and I can't wait to have this chat.
Low expectations. But I want to say that Lisa and I are coming through this in different ways, because Lisa's read the entire trilogy, and this is actually this is the only book that I read full. As I was reading them, I thought, oh, I actually did read some of Wintering, but I was like, one of the things that we find with there's actually at least one sales rep on here, so he shouldn't hear it, but they say, oh, I read the book, but then when you press them, I'm like, I read 50 pages, but I know what it's about. So one of the things that's really great about this book is you really can come from it either way. Like I came to this completely blind, and speaking to Lisa before, there were so many intricacies of the characters that I didn't really know, but enjoyed it just as much. Were you thinking about that? Like how to take a series, like a book that is part of a thing and not scare people off who hadn't read it before?
Yeah, definitely I was. And I'm glad to hear that was your experience, Daniel, that you did feel like you didn't necessarily need those intricacies to enjoy the story. I mean, it would be, of course, the publishing world and the publicists and the editors who drive that world all have ideas about what words you should and shouldn't use with respect to the books that you've written. So I remember when I wrote the first book, The Lighthouse Road, it wasn't my first book, it was actually my second, but the first book in this family saga. And my editor at the time, I said, oh, this is just the first one. And he said, oh, no, we're not going to talk about it like that. This is just a book. This is just The Lighthouse Road. And then when Wintering came out, they didn't want to talk about it at all in the context of this other book. And I knew that was a part of the conversation, that, that these books needed to stand on their own so that customers would come into Boswell's or Books and Company and buy them without having to buy all three of them. And I definitely wrote them with that in mind. Like, I mean, in my own imagination, all three books are connected in the way that a family of 7 generations is connected. Like, you don't need to know about my 4 times great grandmother to know anything about me. But if you do, then maybe my life is a little bit more interesting. And so that was my attitude about it. The other thing that's different about the books, I hope this is true, at least certainly it was my intention that this be the case, is that they're different kind of books. I mean, I approached each one of them with an altogether different attitude about the kind of storytelling that I wanted to do, the kind of stories that they would be. So if The Lighthouse Road is a quiet sort of historical literary novel, and Wintering is more of an adventure story, and Northernmost is somewhere in between those two things, that's all very intentional. So that part of that is for my own satisfaction, right? That I don't get bored just writing the same kind of book over and over again, but also because I wanted the experience of knowing this family over a decade and over 3 books to be one that satisfied all different sorts of readers. And hopefully that's the case. Having said all of that, well, go ahead, Daniel.
Oh no, Lisa's, you said the word storytelling, and I'm like, Lisa, go!
Well, and it's true because, Peter, you did such a good job. You can enter the story at any time. And it's sort of like if I met your uncle first, and then, 50 years later, I met your child, you're getting the stories from different perspectives, but the delight is when you connect it all together as the reader and you find those pieces. But it's not even just from book to book. It's within the story. You have so much storytelling, so many tales and tall tales and lore. So you're creating an overarching story based on these everyday adventures that become family history, family tales. How did you keep it all going? I mean, the voices are different. The storytelling's different. You're layering upon layer over a large period of time.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate that's the effect for you. It certainly is the intended effect, right? That those stories, the stories that the family members either tell each other or learn about each other, and because in Northernmost there are a couple of different modes of storytelling. But that became a preoccupation of mine, I mean, with Wintering, really. And even before that, I mean, I've always been interested in the way our lives derive meaning from the stories that we remember and the stories that we tell people. So the first time I meet you, I wanted to tell you about my children and about my life in Minneapolis and my wife and my dog and, whatever it is that I think is interesting about myself. But those stories that are important to me, they never you never stop telling them. And they're like the, I don't know, the bread and water of our lives, right? Like that's how we communicate with each other. And of course there are other ways, but to me that seems like one of the most important. Certainly in my own life it is one of the most important. And also it strikes me as a curious way of writing a novel and telling a story, because what is a novel after all but a story? And so there are these layers that get sort of folded in or kneaded into the book, and that's the intention, right? And so how to keep them all straight, it's not always easy, of course, because writing a novel is a messy, at least for me, is a big, messy project. There's a lot, there's outlines over here and scene lists over here and character biographies behind me and stacks of pages that may or may not stay in the novel all over the place. But what happens for me is, especially once I get past, say, the first 50 or 100 pages of a book, which are never the same at the end of the process as they are at the beginning. That is, those first 50 or 100 pages always change. Once I get past them, though, and realize how the story is all going to fit together and start to inhabit it like on a pretty much daily basis, it doesn't really matter to me that everything makes sense that first trip through. I'm looking for the things that feel most authentic and most true. And sometimes that means contradicting myself. Sometimes that means repeating myself. And I'll take care of all that in the, in the revision and the editing of the novel. And for the most part, I just want to luxuriate in the storytelling, because I think that if I allow myself to do that, that pleasure that I derive from it is, it's sort of an essential requirement of hoping, planning on the reader enjoying it down the road. There needs to be that intimacy with it, and that sense of naturalness and organicness in the storytelling. And so I have to let it be. It's what happens in the revision that's more difficult, that you have to make sure you're not repeating yourself or contradicting yourself, and that the things you think are helping the story along and making meaning are in fact helping the story along and making meaning.
You provide a rich texture. Go ahead, Daniel.
Well, I was just asking about consistency and inconsistency, since they're all second person stories, not second person, but, as told to stories. Did you actually ever build inconsistency into it, where somebody thinks something, but it turns out in another book you learn, well, that wasn't really the case? And
yes.
That seems like a very complicated thing to do.
It is a complicated thing to do, and I think it's a calculated risk, right? Because in Northernmost, for example, one of the storylines in Northernmost that's most that I get most emotional about is the creator of these stories is this character Baudoin, the man in 1890s who sent his daughter to America. He pines away for her, as I imagine many people did, right? He sent her off ostensibly for a better life, a life full of promise, to get her out of the poverty that they lived in and that he continues to live in Norway in this time. And she goes away. His only daughter goes away, and she's never heard from again. And if a reader is reading Northernmost without having read The Lighthouse Road, they're likely to get attached to that daughter in the way that he is attached to that daughter. But if you've read The Lighthouse Road, you already know about her fate. So you know that all of his emotional, all of the sustenance that he takes from his wishing for her and his longing for her is, it's a kind of a pointless longing. So he doesn't know what some other readers know and what the author already knows. And so, yes, it's almost like a bait and switch sort of thing that's happening. But I think that I don't know. It's a calculated risk, like I say, but I think that it's interesting. I think that it's interesting to tell stories that do that double back on themselves, or that, like you said, contradict themselves. And that happens every day in life, right? We tell half-truths every day. We tell lies every day. We don't do our best to communicate every day. And that's a natural part of storytelling. Maybe you don't, Daniel. I can tell by your expression.
No, my expression is saying, oh, I do it way too much.
Yeah.
Lisa.
Well, in this, because it's so much about family, and it really begs us all to look into our own family history. I mean, I read this, and my grandparents grew up in Minnesota, and they're from Minnesota, but their family's from Sweden, Norway, and France. And I grew up in New Mexico, where I don't have that cultural connection. But every time I read one of your stories, I realize I have a cultural connection. So when you dig, it begs us to look into our own family histories. When you were doing this, did you pull into your family history, and what was it like to layer someone else's as you're creating it with your own?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question to me, because I didn't really, so the whole idea for this family started with a very simple idea, which was this young woman coming from Norway and settling in America. That's what I thought the Lighthouse 10 or 11 years ago, that's what I thought the Lighthouse Road was going to be, was just this simple immigrant story. And as soon as I began to imagine it, I started to see the generations, both the generations that would come after her and the generation that she was leaving behind. And so I started thinking of all the ways that those stories might be interesting. It was almost like accidental that I decided to write this whole big story. That is the story that spans 3 books and 7 generations. And the reason that I was interested in telling her story in the first place, the young woman who comes to America in the first place, is because I have family too. My maternal grandmother's family came from Norway, and she was a huge influence on my life. She lived with me my whole childhood with my parents and our family. And she was there like a second mother sort of thing. And so I was really close with her, learned a ton from her, and not just about how to be, how to make Swedish meatballs, but how to be responsible, and how to be a thoughtful person and a respectful person. And so I felt this great sense of indebtedness to her. And she would tell stories. She came first to New Jersey and then to a farm in North Dakota. And she would tell a story about how her father would go out to milk the cows. And one day she went out there and she saw him, and his face was on the flank of the cow, and he was crying. And she said, well, what's wrong? What's wrong? And he said, oh, I'm just thinking about home. And it was that thing that made me think, oh, that's such an interesting story. When we hear about the American experience, so often we picture, hordes of people coming through Ellis Island, and America just booming, 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 and westward expansion, and it's the great American story. And for plenty of people it was, and for plenty of people it remains, although fewer and fewer all the time, of course. But that story is never just simple. Like, you don't just get on your horse and ride west and become a great American. Like, there's trauma, and there's tragedy, and there's happiness and sadness in equal measure. And those stories have definitely been told, but I wanted to tell a very particular version of that story. This is a very long answer. I promise you I have a point to getting to it. But my experience in that, so I knew that her father, who would be my great-grandfather, some part of him longed for his life back in Norway. And it was intriguing to me, and it was a memory that sticks with me, how 40 years after hearing it for the first time. But it didn't incite in me like this instinct to learn my whole family tree. And where did everyone come from? And where did everyone settle? And what was my Italian great-great-grandfather a shoemaker, or what? Those things didn't occur to me. But eventually I found out a lot of that stuff because I had a cousin that did it. And it was about maybe 6 or 7 years ago that this happened, that she was like, oh, look on Ancestry.com. Here's a huge chunk of our family history, at least on the maternal side of the ledger. And it was like this, all of a sudden, this makes so much more sense to me. My interest in this, in this, many generations family, like, where did it come from? And I think that it's just because, like, there's an instinct in us, whether we're conscious of it or pursue it or not. Like, we come from people, all of us do, and we can't escape that. Like, what happened to my great-grandfather on the farm in North Dakota, that day had a direct effect on my life somehow, And so, so I feel like it was almost like a belated gift to me to take an interest in that.
It's so funny that you said, when I was watching one of your interviews, it must have been 2013, where somebody asked you about your family background. It's like I don't know anything. And like 6 months later, you knew everything.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, as I was reading the book, the book is so, and I don't know if the other books are quite like that, but this book, because both characters interact with Norway, there's it's a very Norwegian book. And in fact, I finished the book and I was like, must write to Sons of Norway right away to invite them to an event. And the other thing that was funny is, like, I had read this book, and the two characters, Greta and it's Odd-Eider, right? I want to say Odd, have, of course, such different experiences with the land. And I had just read Natalie Bakopoulos' Scorpion Fish.
Oh, I haven't read that book yet.
Have you read that yet?
I haven't yet, no.
Yeah, but I can tell, I can do 6 degrees of separation for you on connecting to her. But I was like, this book is to Norway as that book is to Greece. And then I had to Google, what is that called again? Something is to something as something is to something. And it's like, oh, it's an analogy. And then I saw the 4 dots, which I hadn't seen in like 40 years. And it's like, and they stopped using those in the SAT in 2005. So you lead us down rabbit holes, but it all sprung from this connection in Norway. I assume that's intentional, and I assume you bring it so much to life. If you tell me you didn't go over there, I'll cry.
No,
I'll cry from happiness. What a great job.
I did go there, but one of my favorite things to say about this book is that, so going back again to the lighthouse, and I don't mean to keep doing this, I want to talk about Northernmost more, but when I decided on this village in Norway, this town called Hammerfest, to be the origin of this family, it was totally arbitrary. I went to the map and looked for the most remote, the farthest north town on the map in Norway and picked it, and it was just that simple. And so it was, like I say, totally arbitrary. But what happened over the years is that I spent, of course, a lot of time in my imagination in that village. And I learned as much as I could by doing research online. I have a whole library of books, half of them in Norwegian, which I don't read, about this village and this town. And it's not like there's an encyclopedia of information about it, but there's enough information and enough photographs that I've seen over the years to feel like, oh, I can do this. I can bring, and with Google Maps, now you can see it in contemporary time. And I was like, I can bring this place to life, at least in my imagination. And until Northernmost, it wasn't terrifically important that the place come to life in the way that it does in Northernmost. But finally I was like, well, if I'm going to finish this book, I should go and visit it so that I can, authenticate a few details or something like that. And I can remember so well, Daniel, I flew there. A lot of people who would visit Hammerfest would take the Hurtigruten cruise that goes up and down the coast, and you hear about lots of people doing that. But in the interest of saving time, I flew, and I remember flying into the airport at Hammerfest, and it's just like a moonscape, right? It's just rocks and snow. Even in July when I was there, it was still snow covered. Not altogether snow covered, but the mountaintops are all covered in snow. And I remember looking out at the airplane and seeing town and landing and getting into the rental car and driving downtown and having this feeling like, I have been here. Like, my people are from here. I was not mistaken about this place. All the things in my mind that I conjured up to make it a sort of haunted place and a spooky place, and the weather and how low the weather hangs there, and the way the wind feels off of the sound, and the way the islands look in the distance, like all of it felt really like, I'm just coming home. Like, this is just where my people come from. Like, I had that feeling, and it was very strange. And it turned out that I wrote a couple of scenes about Hammerfest after having been there, but most of it I wrote before I ever visited. But the Spitsbergen sections, I visited there as well. And that required, because I hadn't spent as much time there in my imagination, that required the visit there, just to see the awesome expansiveness of the landscape and the just terrible remoteness of it. There's nothing forever, no people. There's walruses on one side of the sound and reindeer and polar bears on the other side of the sound. And it's just like this place out of time. And I had to experience that, I think, in order to capture it in the way that I do in the book. But yes, I did go, but most of the Hammerfest and the Norway stuff was written before I ever went.
Well, before I pass it to Lisa, I just wanted to say, I heard you have a lot of books in Norwegian that aren't translated. Maybe you'll find a charming musician who's the most attractive man in town to translate them for you.
Maybe so. I should have been on the lookout while I was there.
Lisa?
You have them and you don't know what they say.
Yeah. I mean, you can Google translate almost anything now, but if you've done that, you know how stilted it comes out, and it's practically easier to read it in Norwegian than it is to read the Google translation into English. But yeah, like I have a book about the boats of Hammerfest. Like, these are the boats historically these are the kind of boats that this town has seen over the years. And of course, in Northernmost, Odd is a struggling fisherman. So his little fairing, that's the name of his boat, it's a character unto itself. And so I discovered that through this book in Norwegian about the boats of Hammerfest.
That would have been a cool discovery.
Yeah,
that's a treasure. One of the things I noticed too that really came out strong in this book was just the amount of faith and hope the whole story has, the immigrant experience has, especially for this family, and how each character, even Greta, and the choices that she has to make, and the leaps of faith, the hope, the faith in something else. So you want to talk about just how, if that just strengthened in the end, or if it was sort of a continuation with just looking at the immigrant story.
It's so interesting that you asked that question, because I was just thinking about this today for different reasons, but thinking specifically about this and about the tenor of the books that I've written. And wondering, and this sounds like all I do is sit around and think about myself. I promise there's a reason for it. I won't talk about it, but I was like, why have you written these books? And thinking about them, like, they don't deal with necessarily happy things, right? There is a lot of tragedy, and there is a lot of suspect behavior and peculiar personalities and morally ambiguous characters. And the easy answer is just to say, well, those are the characters that I like to read when I'm engrossed in a book, right? Like, I'm more interested in those characters that surprise you and those characters that are unpredictable than I am in somebody who I feel like I know and can predict their every move. But as I was thinking through it, I was like, there's more hopefulness in this book. Like, even Odd Einar, who is sort of delusionally hopeful, his spirit is never, for all the reasons that it might be, is never crushed. And where did that hopefulness come from? And even Greta, who's navigating a really difficult contemporary situation, which is she doesn't love her husband anymore. She doesn't want to be married to him anymore. She's got 2 kids to worry about in this transaction. Where's she going to live? How's she going to make a living? All those questions that dog people who are in the process of making that decision. She manages, partly because she meets this terrific, handsome Norwegian, but also because she insists that she change her life. She has to, or she's going to die a miserable person. And that's the last thing she wants. And so there's hopefulness in that. And I think that what, in my own life and experience, I think there's an evolution that I can trace in these books. That whereas at the beginning, there's just a lot of wonder and confusion, and Safe from the Sea and the Lighthouse Road, and even in Wintering. In Northernmost, there's a turn, I feel like, that I've made that is towards hopefulness and happiness, where there isn't necessarily a ton of those things in the previous books. And I think that's a consequence of getting a little older I mean, I turned 50 this year, and not that I'm some old sage guy, but I feel like I'm learning how to navigate life myself. And it doesn't have to be as gloomy as it's always felt to me, even with the terrific life that I have and all the luck that I have in my life. And I think that's reflected in the characters.
Yeah, and I think the whole passage you wrote about the fawn, I don't think you could write that as a 30-year-old.
No.
You know, and yeah, so you're right, it does come with maturity.
Yeah. The fawn, for those people who haven't read the book, there's one of the things that I did in the writing of this book, because so much of it takes place in the Arctic. And in fact, there are real life Norwegian explorers who sort of pepper the book throughout. One of them actually plays an important role in getting Odainer out of Hammerfest and up to Spitsbergen. One of the things that I had to do was learn the language of that place, that is of the Arctic and of Spitsbergen and of the snow there and the ice there and the boats that explorers used and the tools that they used to explore. So I kept this whole glossary of that. And one of the things that, one of the words that I learned was phone, F-O-N-N, which in the lore of Arctic and polar exploration is loosely translated as the eternal snow, like the snow that never ends, that kind of thing. And I loved this idea. Like, it was such a beautiful Melvillian sort of idea to me. And I thought about it all the time. And I'm like, how am I ever going to sneak this into the book? And it ended up coming into the book via one of the men that Odainer works for in the Arctic, who's a sort of, Ahab-esque character in charge of his little sealing vessel, and who talks to his crew like he's a sort of preacher, and his faith, it turns out, is in the snow, is in the phone, in the phone. And so that's what that's all about. I love that. It's my favorite scene in the whole book.
Yeah. Great.
I keep getting distracted by your bookshelf. I'm playing that game where you try to figure out what the book, I mean, the Sontag bio is in really large letters. I'm like, oh, I think I can see Mrs. Fletcher, and I think that's Great Believer. So everybody can play the game, and maybe if people submit what all the books are, we'll give some.
A lot of these books are my wife's books. We just moved into this house a few months ago, and we're mostly set up. But the moving around of books is a sort of weekly activity, I guess you could call it.
And the combining.
Yeah.
When you combine bookshelves, do you keep them separate or do you combine them?
Well, in my office, my work books, those are, I keep those separate, but no, otherwise it's just a free-for-all. I think that what happened is that at our old house, her books were in one place and mine were in another. And when we unpacked them, her books ended up here and a lot of mine ended up over there. So there is this process of commingling, getting them together.
We're still separate. Different places. One of the things that, because when I was Lisa and I were talking about the book, having our own book club, and I was like, oh, he's like the John Krakauer of fiction, and it's like, and some would say, well, there actually are other fiction writers like that. But then I said, are all the books so intimate? Because there's a lot of intimacy scenes in this. And Lisa said, no, actually. So this was a sort of a different thing. And I think it's, would you like to comment on that? Would you ready to play?
Yes. And
you were melting the ice.
Yeah. It's so interesting because to me, it's a very significant part of the story. And you describe it as intimacy. I think I would say that the scenes between Odainer and Inger, that those are intimate scenes. They're romantic and physical, but they're not, they're treated in a way that a writer from that era might have treated them. That is, with a delicacy and with a suggestiveness that Greta's scenes are not. Greta's scenes are pretty wide open. I've had one reviewer called it soft porn, which I took only a sort of shrugging offense at. but no one wants to ask me about it. So I'm very glad that you did. And I have a couple
Let's go for it.
that I would say. One is that it is different, and part of what I do, what I like to do, is figure out new ways to express myself as a writer. And that sounds really like almost cheesy or something, but it's just true. Like, I don't want to write the same thing over and over again. I want to challenge myself to write different kinds of stories, to write different scenes, to write from different points of view and in different tenses and all of that. And I was like, this woman is on a sexual odyssey in part. Like, she doesn't realize it, but it doesn't take her long to realize it. And so how can I write about that? And I spent a lot of time like, oh, I'll just suggest that that's what's happening. But the longer I put it off, the more I thought, this is really important to her. This is a really important part of her transformation. And she's entitled to it. Like, she's a woman who's very frustrated in this part of her life. And part of what happens to her is that it's almost like she's liberated again. Even though she's a married woman with children, she's liberated. And so I was like, she should have this. She should get this. And I should try writing some of it and see what happens. And so that's what I did. And the more I wrote about it, and I think that there are probably like 3 scenes with her or something that are in some way sort of graphic, or if not graphic, it's pretty plainly on the page. You don't have to use your imagination much. And I was like, man, I know people are going to ask about this, and what am I going to say about it? So this has actually been on my mind for a long time. And I was like, you know what? If I were writing this from a man's point of view, no one would even, people might think about it, but they think about it differently because it's from a woman's point of view, I think. And I think that that's an important distinction. And I tried very hard to make sure that it was, that I did as much as I could to authenticate it, right? I talked to people about it. I had women that I trust read it and make suggestions and so it's not like I was just winging it, but she gets it. Like, this is part of her reward for her struggle, are these moments with her lover that are significant in her transformation as a character. And if it was just some guy going around Norway, hitting on the waitresses, people wouldn't think much about it. It'd be, oh, yeah, there's some sex in that book, but it's like, oh, there's sex in this book. And I'm like, there is, and she gets it. She earned it, she deserves it, and she's gonna have it.
Speechless, are you, Lisa?
What?
Speechless?
No, I'm not speechless. I'm just waiting for you. It was your question.
I've got nothing to follow up.
But Peter, that's a really good point, how you say that. It is part of that transformation, and we often don't write that perspective.
Yeah. And I don't want to sound like, I think of myself as a feminist, but I don't mean for it to sound like I'm being a feminist by giving her this. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is, in the course of human life, and especially in Greta's life at this time, like the sexual relationship that she has with this man is an enormous part of her transformation as a frustrated, unhappy person to someone who's not those things. And so why not give it to her? Why not? It's a joyful thing, and yes, it will make some people blush. It makes me blush to talk about it, but it's also like the most natural thing in the world, almost literally the most natural thing in the world, and hell, it's fun.
And you don't make it seem like she had to have it to be complete.
No.
It was part of just being a whole person, which was also a nice way to do it.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about, if Lisa, can I ask another one?
Yeah,
or should I? Okay.
Oh.
So you had said, in another interview that you really love maps. And I was curious, as you had if you had tried to get Knopf to do a map end paper on this book, because I'm sure you can do it in all of them, but in this book there's there's some really interesting journeys, and I started visualizing, and I thought, oh, you could do a giveaway, a map giveaway, get someone to make a map of the story.
It's so funny that you say that, because, okay, so the truth is that I shouldn't say that. Most of the writers that I know, they have some, as they're working on a book and getting close to finishing it, or in the process of, copy editing it and reading page proofs, like we start to get these visions, like, oh, what's the cover going to look like? And how could they gussy it up? And what would be the funnest thing? And I keep maps all over the place, and look at them all the time, both for my work and in my life. I love them. They're one of my favorite things, which is super dorky, I know, but it's just true. And I definitely had visions of like there being a map of Spitsbergen on the front and a map of the North Shore on the back, the North Shore of Lake Superior or something like that. And though I had some say in the cover art this time, I felt like that was my bullet to use, was requesting that we continue to work on the cover instead of settling for the first thing. So didn't want to ask for too much. But in my dream, there is there is a map in the end papers, or a map at the beginning, like there is a family tree. The family tree was the other thing that I asked for. I was like, I really think that people will appreciate this, especially people who have read all the books. Like there's a lot of names and going through this book, and that will probably help people. So that was another, I guess, bullet that I had to use there. But I would have loved that. I would have absolutely loved it. Yeah.
It's maybe the next one.
Yeah.
Work your way, it's like, because I just love a map and paper.
Yeah.
All right, Lisa, go.
Oh, do we have time for me to ask another?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, I'm kind of running out. Let me think.
Oh, well, we could ask the audience. Okay, so Sharon Nagel would like to say that those look like some of the Ferrante books on the left-hand side of your bookcase. I saw NW, and I know this is really weird because it's such an old book, but I'm convinced that I can't remember exactly how it's pronounced, Dissigia, the little black seamstress book, the Chinese book.
Oh yeah.
Do you remember that one?
Yeah.
I thought I saw the red on that. In any case, we do have somebody who said they love Safe from the Sea, one of the best books they read in years, and they figure you should talk, since we've been talking so much about the 3 books, which, by the way, in modern contemporary lingo, I was going to say, it seems acceptable to call them companion novels. You can't call them sequels.
Yes, that's a terrific word. I'm going to adopt that, Danielle. Thank you.
You should go for it.
Yeah.
They are definitely companions.
Yeah.
So somebody wanted you to say a few sentences about Safe from the Sea.
Boy, it's so interesting to hear. Of course, it sits on my shelf with the other books that I've written.
You wrote it.
But that book came out, it's 10 years ago. And it's so, I can remember so well. I think for wintering, Boswell's was the first place I visited, and Books and Company was the second place. And for Safe from the Sea, Boswell's was the second place I visited, and Books and Company was the third, I think. So so many of my memories of Safe from the Sea. You used to have someone who worked for you, Daniel. You probably are still friends with her, named Stacy Williams.
Sure.
And she was just so supportive of that book. And she showed up at one of the other events that I did. Now we're like talking about old friends or something, which is not talking about Safe from the Sea. But for whatever reason, I'm really struck with, like, at the prospect of talking with you from Boswell's and you, Lisa, from Books and Company, about the memories of that, of going there and not, like, first-time author, little tiny literary press that not a lot of people have heard from, and the way that you guys treated me, like, so welcoming, and it was just such an amazing experience, and it actually helped me to feel like, oh, this is a this is a real book. And I was, there's like this, I can remember it well, this sensation of like, yeah, I wrote this book and it's coming out, but it's like all a dream. It's not something that's really happening. And so it was those conversations with people that I had at Boswell's and at your store, Lisa, that like was like, oh no, it is a real book, and this is something I have to talk about, and it's such a lovely memory for me. But I wrote that book. I mean, I started it 20 years ago. It's so long ago in my memory. But what's interesting, and what I think Sharon, you said her name was, the character, one of the main characters in that book is a character named Noah Tor. And I'm just about done writing another book, and Noah makes a guest appearance in that book as well. Yeah, and so it's been on my mind, and it's not something that I have thought much. You don't. It's not like I sit around and daydream about the books I've written, but I've had to sit around and daydream about the books that I've written because Noah's making an appearance in the new book. So,
we always get a question about writing. Your writing rituals and things like that. And I'm just curious, it's not usually the question I ask because someone from the audience always asks it, but I am interested when you move like you did, when you do a major move, has that changed your writing ritual at all?
For the first time in a long time, and certainly it is the best now, I have an office, like just around the corner here, an office that is all mine, that is just like, it's the office that I've always dreamed of. It's beautiful, and there's windows all over and built-in shelves, and I just love it. And it has made me like so much more productive. I think between never leaving the house or rarely leaving the house and having this office and having this book that I'm really excited about working on, it has changed how I work. Like, I'm working way more efficiently and with greater energy than I have in the past, which doesn't exactly answer the question, because in terms of, the craft part of it and the how-to part of it, that's not especially different, but there's something about being here. And, I think frankly, it's sort of feeling finally settled down in life, which the last 5 years haven't exactly been easy in a lot of ways. I've gone through a lot of changes in my personal life, and finally feeling like I'm home now. Like, this is where I was supposed to be all along, and this is where I am, and I'm happy. It's much easier to work, and it's, it's like it's more fun. It feels better. So
don't take it for granted that you're writing a lot in COVID, because a lot of people, there's some people who are having trouble. So
yeah, I know, for sure. I'm friends with a lot of those people. Yeah. I hear about it often. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about the new book?
Oh, no, I don't know. I know that it's called The Ski Jumpers, and that it's pretty different than
I was just going to ask you about the ski jumpers, because I heard you were a ski jumper until you were like in your teens, right?
And he jumped in Oconomowaukee.
Yeah. One of my favorite ski jumping families is an Oconomowaukee family, the Keck family. I'm sure that I think that they've been to events at the store. Yeah. I know that the last time I was in Oconomowaukee, I had dinner with one of them afterwards, after the event. I don't know what to say about it. It's different. It's a very different novel. It's an urban novel, so it doesn't take place in these small towns or in the wilderness like all the previous books do. And it's way more character driven. And it's a story of a couple of brothers, former ski jumpers, who have drifted apart over the years, one of them on a pretty conventional path, one of them on a not so conventional path. And they have to reunite because of some family business, and they do some reminiscing, and they iron out some differences. And so there's some crime, there's like drug dealing and people with guns and stuff like that. So we'll see, but it's different. It's just a terrifically different book. And I think that maybe wrapping up the Ide family books and all these novels set in olden times and in cold places and and in little ports on the North Sea, and coming back to Minneapolis, which is where I'm from and where I live, and writing about that, there's something that's invigorating about that. And I think that's part of also of why I'm, working as happily as I am. Yeah. I'll work on that description by the.
That was enough. That was good enough. That's a teaser.
Yeah.
And it's also, it's brave to jump into something completely different when you've become known for writing a certain kind of book. And I always appreciate when authors do that.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying that. I mean, it is, again, another calculated risk. But this is a book that another book that I started. I mean, my first notebooks for this are from 2008. So this has been in my mind for a really, really long time. Wow. And I've tried and failed at writing it repeatedly, I think 3 or 4 times, and had almost given up on it and thought I would give it one more try. And this time it's working out. So yeah, we'll see. I hope people like it. I hope it, because you're right. People, it's not like I have some enormous following, but there are a few people who read my books, and they do expect a certain, certain similarities. I think they know what to expect, the readers who follow me in my career. And this is, I mean, it's not like it is unrecognizable, but it's just different. I've joked that there are very few trees and very few rocks in this book, and that's a departure.
Do we have any other questions from the audience?
I think this is a questionless audience, but
you have one chance. Believe it. Well, I just have to say I enjoy so much the storytelling part of it. Like we've been talking about, it just has such a rich texture, and it helps see the world differently. And I think right now during this time with COVID, it's nice to have all these different ways of seeing story and telling story come forward, because we're all weaving different tales. So thank you, Peter, very, very much.
Thank you. I agree that, everyone is on edge for many reasons, not least of which the pandemic we're living through. And for myself, I've found the 3 things, but 2 book things that are like the only thing that can distract me now and can make me feel normal are reading and writing. And so I know that it's strange times, and that, like not even all the bookstores are open now for browsing, or if they are, they only let 5 people in at a time or 10 people in at a time. And it's not as easy as it used to be. But I think that when we get to the other side of this, that is the other side of this pandemic, people are going to be sort of fortified. The readers of the world are going to be fortified by having spent the last year reading up and re-engaging with books in a way that even good readers haven't necessarily been for the last few years. And they're going to require Boswell's and Books and Company to be there in order to do that. So please support your independent booksellers in Wisconsin there. You have a whole slew of them. They're the folks, they're the gatekeepers and the arbiters of good books and of good taste. So please support them so they can be around when we get to the other side of this. And to you guys too. I know it sounds like I'm just being solicitous. I'm not. You guys have been a couple of the best supporters of my career, and I'm so thankful to have had the chance to talk to you tonight and to see your smiling faces. And that too is making me feel like things are a little bit more like normal.
Just as a little, how you get the survey after you visit the website. So how did you think the 2 interview thing went?
You're asking me.
Sure,
I thought it was terrific. And I don't know that it would be so terrific if I didn't know you both and feel comfortable talking to you. I mean, I'm sure it would, because any bookseller is going to, come to this prepared. But I loved it. And that's one thing actually. So I'm only doing about 10 of these events now instead of what would have been 30 or 40 of them if the world were normal. But every one of them is in conversation, either with the proprietor of the bookstore or another writer I'm trying to think a few other people as well. And there's something that feels more natural about that to me than a normal reading. So if I were on tour for this book, I would have come to Boswell's and then to Books and Company each night. I would have done a talk and a reading and taken questions from the audience, and I love that. But this feels a little bit more like we're having a more serious conversation, or a more sustained serious conversation, and I love that. Love that.
We like them too. We've actually been moving a lot of our in-person ones to conversations.
Yeah.
Chris will be, Chris and I do a lot of them. Lisa does a lot of them too. So, well, cool. We were just thrilled for this. Thank you so much for making us one of the 10, and continued success to you. And thanks everybody in the virtual Boswell Books and Company Readings from Oconomowaukee audience for joining in. We wouldn't have virtual bookstores without you, and hope to see you at another event. Don't forget Michael Perry's September 24th, I think. So.
It's September 24th.
Yay!
Yay!
Thanks so much, you guys.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Peter. It's great to see you.
Take care.
Bye.